Help! Please, it's me, Daniel. My house, it's flooding. The voice was muffled by the howling wind and the relentless pounding of rain against the windows. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Daniel? My neighbor? I rushed to the door, peering through the peephole to see him standing there, drenched to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead and his clothes clinging to his body like a second skin. Hold on. I called, fumbling with the lock before yanking the door open. The storm surged in around him, a gust of wind and rain that made me stumble back. Get in, quick. He staggered inside, water dripping from every inch of him, and I slammed the door shut against the chaos outside. For a moment, we just stood there, breathing heavily, the only sound the muffled roar of the storm and the steady drip-drip of water pooling around his boots. Thank you, he gasped, running a hand through his soaked hair. I didn't know where else to go. The water, it's coming in through the windows, the doors. It's okay, I said, cutting him off. My voice was softer than I expected, and I realized how close we were standing, the air between us thick with something I couldn't quite name. Let's get you dry. The storm had been brewing all day, an oppressive weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. I'd watched from my kitchen window as the sky darkened, the clouds churning like something alive. By afternoon, the rain had started, a steady downpour that quickly turned into a deluge. The wind howled, rattling the windows and sending debris skittering across the street. I'd lit candles, just in case the power went out, and wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. And then, the knock. Knock, knock, knock. Urgent, desperate. Here, I said, handing him a towel and a set of dry clothes, sweatpants and an old sweatshirt that would probably be too big on him. The bathroom's down the hall. Go change. I'll make some tea. He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine. They were a warm brown, flecked with gold, and they held something I couldn't place. Gratitude? Vulnerability? Thank you, he said again, his voice softer this time, and then he disappeared down the hall. While he changed, I busied myself in the kitchen, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove. The power flickered once, twice, but held. I lit a few more candles, the soft glow casting long shadows on the walls. When Daniel reappeared, the oversized clothes made him look younger, almost boyish, and I couldn't help but smile. Here, I said, handing him a steaming mug. It's chamomile. Should help you warm up. We settled on the couch, the space between us charged with something unspoken. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, there was a quiet calm, the kind of stillness that makes it easier to breathe, easier to speak. So, I began, breaking the silence. This isn't exactly how I imagined spending my evening. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Me neither. Though, I have to say, this is a definite improvement over being waist-deep in floodwater. I laughed, the tension between us easing just a little. Fair point. I'm glad you're here, though. It's nice not to be alone in this. Yeah, he said, his gaze softening. It is. The conversation flowed naturally after that. We talked about the storm, about our jobs, about the neighborhood. And then, somehow, we found ourselves sharing more, stories of our pasts, our fears, our hopes. I never thought I'd get divorced, he admitted, staring into his mug. My marriage, it wasn't perfect, but I thought we'd make it work. When it ended, I felt like I'd failed somehow. I know what you mean, I said, my chest tightening. My last relationship, it was toxic. I stayed longer than I should have because I was scared of being alone. But leaving, it was the hardest and best thing I've ever done. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. It takes a lot of courage to walk away from something like that. So does starting over, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. The storm began to subside, the rain easing into a gentle patter against the windows. The candles had burned low, their light flickering softly, casting a warm glow over the room. We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that feels like a shared breath, like the space between heartbeats. Do you ever feel like you're stuck? I asked finally, the words escaping before I could stop them. Like you're waiting for something to change but you don't know what? He nodded slowly. All the time. But I think sometimes we have to let things in, even when it's scary. Maybe especially then. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I felt something shift inside me, a door opening that I hadn't even realized was closed. "Do you think you're ready for that?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes holding mine. I don't know," I admitted. "But maybe I could be." When Daniel left the next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. The air was crisp, the sky a pale, cloudless blue. He paused at the door, turning back to me. "Thank you," he said again, but this time it felt different. Like he wasn't just thanking me for the dry clothes and the warm tea. "You're welcome," I replied, my voice steady despite the fluttering in my chest. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. I stood there for a long moment, the warmth of his words lingering in the air. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. The week after the storm passed in a blur of routine, but something felt different. I couldn't shake the memory of that night, the way Daniel's voice had softened when he spoke about his divorce, the way his eyes had held mine in the flickering candlelight. It wasn't just the warmth of the tea or the safety of my home, it was him. On Thursday evening, I was unloading groceries when I heard footsteps on the porch. My heart leapt into my throat before I even turned around. "Hey," Daniel's voice came, warm and familiar. I spun, clutching a bag of groceries to my chest like it could shield me. He stood there, hands in his pockets, his dark hair slightly windblown, those brown eyes flecked with gold catching the fading sunlight. "Hi," I managed, my voice sounding higher than I intended. "I just wanted to return this." He held out the oversized sweater I'd lent him that night. It was neatly folded, and I could smell the faint scent of laundry detergent mingling with something unmistakably him. "You didn't have to," I said, taking it from him. Our fingers brushed, and I felt a jolt of electricity that made me drop my gaze. "I wanted to," he said simply. He hesitated, then added, "And I wanted to see you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I felt my cheeks flush, and I busied myself with putting the bag of groceries on the counter. "Do you want to come in?" I asked, not looking at him. "I'd like that," he said softly. I stepped aside, and he walked in, his presence filling the small space in a way that made my pulse quicken. I gestured toward the couch, and he sat down, his long legs stretching out in front of him. I hovered awkwardly by the kitchen counter, unsure of what to do with myself. "Can I get you anything? Tea? Coffee?" I asked, my voice too bright. "Tea would be great," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. I busied myself with the kettle, trying to steady my breathing. When the tea was ready, I brought 2 mugs over and sat down next to him, leaving a careful distance between us. We sipped in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Thank you," he said finally, setting his mug down. "For that night. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." I froze, my mug halfway to my lips. "Me neither," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to look at me, his gaze intense. "I've been feeling lost, I guess. After the divorce, I thought I'd never feel like myself again. But being here with you that night, it made me feel like maybe I could." I set my mug down, my hands trembling slightly. "I know what you mean," I said, my voice shaky. "I've been alone for so long, I thought that was just how it was going to be. But meeting you, it's like I've been living in black and white, and suddenly everything's in color." He reached out, his hand hovering over mine for a moment before he gently took it in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt a wave of emotion crash over me. "I don't want to mess this up," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "Me neither," I whispered. We sat there for a long moment, our hands intertwined, the silence between us charged with something I couldn't quite name. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his face inches from mine. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Is this okay?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. And then he kissed me, his lips soft and tentative against mine. It was gentle, patient, like he was giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hand coming up to cradle his cheek. When we finally broke apart, I felt breathless, my whole body tingling. His eyes were dark, full of an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I've been wanting to do that since the night of the storm," he admitted, his voice rough. "Me too," I said, my cheeks burning. He smiled, a slow, warm smile that made my stomach flip. "You're incredible," he said, his thumb brushing against my cheek. I laughed, a nervous, breathless sound. "I'm really not." "You are," he insisted, his tone serious. "You're kind, and strong, and beautiful. And I feel like the luckiest man in the world just to be here with you." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them away. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "You don't have to say anything," he said, leaning in to kiss me again. This time it was deeper, more urgent, like he was pouring everything he couldn't say into that one moment. When we finally pulled apart, I felt like the world had shifted on its axis. Everything felt different, brighter, more alive. He rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "Neither am I," I whispered. We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside fading away. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Eventually, he pulled back, his eyes searching mine. "Can I take you out sometime?" "Like, on a real date?" he asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. I smiled, my heart swelling. "I'd like that." He grinned, a wide, boyish smile that made my stomach flip. "Good. Because I've been thinking about it all week." "So have I admitted, my cheeks flushing. He leaned in, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "You're going to be the death of me," he murmured, his voice teasing but with an undercurrent of something deeper. I laughed, my heart full. "I think you'll manage." He kissed me again, slow and sweet, and I felt like I was floating. When he finally pulled away, he stood, holding out his hand. "Walk me to the door," he asked, his eyes twinkling. I took his hand, letting him pull me to my feet. We walked to the door, our fingers laced together, and I felt a pang of disappointment when we reached it. He turned to me, his expression soft. "I'll see you soon," he promised. "I'll be here," I said, my voice steady despite the butterflies in my stomach. He kissed me one last time, a quick, tender kiss that left me breathless. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, my heart racing. And then I heard his voice again, faint but clear. "Hey," he called. I opened the door to find him standing there, a sheepish look on his face. "Forgot something," he said, stepping back inside. "What?" I started, but before I could finish, he kissed me again, his hands coming up to cup my face. "That," he said, grinning as he pulled away. I stood there, the door still open, my lips tingling from the warmth of his kiss. The air between us felt charged, like the storm hadn't fully passed. Daniel's grin softened into something more tentative, his eyes searching mine as though waiting for permission to stay. "You're trouble, you know that?" I said. My voice barely above a whisper, but the corner of my mouth betrayed me, curling into a smile. "Only the good kind," he replied, stepping closer again. His hand brushed against mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The storm outside had quieted, but inside, there was a different kind of electricity, one that hummed in the space between us. I closed the door, shutting out the world, and turned to face him. "So, this date you mentioned," I began, trailing off as I searched for the right words. "Tomorrow night," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of nerves. "If that's not too soon." I hesitated, the weight of his offer settling over me. It wasn't just a date, it was a step into something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But then, when had I ever been sure? Life had a way of throwing me off balance, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop fighting it. "Tomorrow night," I agreed, nodding. His smile widened, and for a moment, it felt like the world was just the two of us, standing in the dim light of my living room. But then he moved closer again, his hand finding mine, and everything else faded away. "I should probably go," he said, though he made no move to leave. His thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand, sending shivers up my arm. Probably, I echoed, but my voice lacked conviction. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. But not just yet. I tilted my head, our noses brushing, and for a moment, we just stood there, breathing each other in. His other hand came up to rest on my waist, pulling me gently closer. My heart raced, and I could feel the heat of his body through the thin fabric of his shirt. Daniel, I started, but the words caught in my throat. His name sounded like a plea, a question, a promise. Shoo, he whispered, his lips brushing against mine. Don't overthink it. And then he kissed me again, slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. My hands found their way to his shoulders, anchoring myself as the room seemed to spin around us. It was different from the kisses before, this one was deeper, more intentional, as if he was trying to tell me something words couldn't capture. When he finally pulled away, I was breathless, my chest rising and falling as I tried to steady myself. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, and I could feel the rapid beat of his heart against my palm. I should go, he said again, his voice rough. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to argue. You should. He stepped back, his hand lingering on mine for a moment before he let go. But instead of turning toward the door, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers brushing against my cheek. Tomorrow, he said, his voice firm, as if he needed to remind both of us. Tomorrow, I repeated, my voice barely audible. He gave me one last look, a mix of longing and determination, before finally turning and walking out the door. I stood there, listening as his footsteps faded down the porch steps, the sound swallowed by the stillness of the night. The house felt emptier without him, the air cooler, and I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold on to the warmth he'd left behind. My mind raced, replaying every touch, every word, and I couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of a single candle on the mantel, and sat down on the couch, staring into the flickering flame. My heart was still pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that I was standing on the edge of something new and terrifying and beautiful. The storm had passed, but the aftermath lingered, and as I sat there in the quiet, I realized I wasn't ready to let go of the chaos just yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping gently against the window. The storm had returned, but it was softer now, more of a murmur than a roar. I lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, my mind drifting back to the night before. Daniel's kiss, his touch, the way he'd looked at me, it all felt like a dream, something too fragile to hold on to. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and tonight, I would see him again. I got up, padding to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea. As I waited for the water to boil, I leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the rain-soaked world outside. My thoughts wandered, and for the first time in a long time, they didn't spiral into doubt or fear. Instead, they lingered on the possibility of what tonight could bring. The kettle whistled, pulling me from my thoughts, and I poured the water over the tea bag, watching as the steam rose in delicate swirls. I carried the cup to the living room, settling into the corner of the couch where Daniel had sat just the night before. His scent still lingered on the fabric, and I breathed it in, letting it soothe the nerves that had begun to creep in. I spent the morning in a kind of haze, my mind alternating between excitement and apprehension. I tried to distract myself with chores, but every time I paused, my thoughts drifted back to him. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I was a bundle of restless energy, pacing the house as I waited for the hours to pass. When the doorbell finally rang, I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I took a deep breath, smoothing my hands over my dress, and walked to the door. I opened it to find Daniel standing there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, his hair damp from the rain. He looked nervous, but there was a warmth in his eyes that made my stomach flip. "Hi," he said, holding out the flowers. "Hi," I replied, taking them from him. Their scent was sweet and earthy, and I brought them to my nose, inhaling deeply. "Ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Ready." He held out his hand, and I took it, his fingers intertwining with mine. His touch was familiar now, and it gave me a sense of grounding as we stepped out into the rain. He led me to his car, opening the door for me before walking around to the driver's side. As we drove, the conversation flowed easily, our words mingling with the sound of the rain on the windshield. He told me about his day, and I shared bits of my morning, but there was an undercurrent to our words, a tension that I couldn't quite place. When we arrived at the restaurant, a cozy little place tucked away on a quiet street, he parked the car and turned to me. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "Me too," I replied, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. We got out of the car, and as we walked toward the restaurant, he reached for my hand again. His grip was firm, reassuring, and I let myself relax into it, the weight of his touch grounding me in the moment. The hostess seated us at a small table by the window, the rain outside creating a soft, rhythmic backdrop to our conversation. We ordered our food, and as we waited, Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Tell me something I don't know about you," he said, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Like what?" I asked, my cheeks warming under his gaze. "Anything," he said with a shrug. "The little things. The things that make you, you." I hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "I'm afraid of the dark," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head, his expression softening. "Really?" I nodded. "Always have been. Even now, I sleep with a nightlight." He chuckled, and for a moment, I felt self-conscious. But then he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "That's adorable," he said, and there was no mockery in his tone, only warmth. The food arrived, and as we ate, the conversation flowed easily, the tension from earlier melting away. By the time we finished, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air between us felt charged with something new, something that neither of us was quite ready to name. As we walked back to the car, he slowed, turning to face me. "I had a really good time tonight," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Me too," I replied, my heart racing. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "Can I kiss you again?" I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, and for a moment, the world fell away. When he pulled back, his eyes were soft, filled with something that I couldn't quite place. "Let's do this again," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of nerves. I hesitated, the weight of his words settling over me. "Yes," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's." I stood at the door, watching as Daniel's car disappeared down the street, the sound of the engine fading into the night. My lips still tingled from the kiss, a faint warmth lingering where his hands had rested on my shoulders. I closed the door softly, leaning against it for a moment, my heart a chaotic rhythm against my chest. The house felt different now, charged, as though the air itself had shifted. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly, trying to steady myself. The next day passed in a blur. I found myself distracted, my thoughts drifting back to him at the most inopportune moments. The way his eyes had held mine, the quiet confidence in his voice, the way his touch had felt both familiar and entirely new. It was as though he had unlocked something in me, something I had kept carefully tucked away. And now, it refused to be contained. That evening, I was in the kitchen, trying to focus on chopping vegetables for dinner, when the doorbell rang. I froze, the knife hovering over the cutting board. "It's him." The thought came unbidden, a surge of anticipation rushing through me. I wiped my hands on a towel, forcing myself to move calmly to the door. When I opened it, there he was, standing on my porch, hands in his pockets, a small smile playing on his lips. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his warm brown eyes flecked with gold catching the evening light. He looked different. More relaxed, more open. "Hi," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Hi," I replied, my voice equally quiet. I stepped back, gesturing for him to come inside. He followed me into the living room, and for a moment, we stood there, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. "I was in the neighborhood," he said finally, rubbing the back of his neck. "Thought I'd stop by." I nodded, my heart doing that strange little skip again. "I'm glad you did." He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. "I couldn't stop thinking about last night," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "About us." My breath caught, and I looked away, my cheeks warming. "Neither could I confessed, my voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver up my spine. "I know this is new," he said slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "But I want to see where it goes. With you." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. It had been so long since I had let myself feel this way, since I had allowed myself to hope. And yet, here he was, standing in front of me, his honesty disarming, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "I want that too," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His smile widened, and he took another step closer, his hand finding mine again, this time more firmly. "Good," he said, his voice soft but sure. "Because I don't want to waste any more time." He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, and for a moment, the world fell away. It was a kiss that spoke of promises, of possibilities, of something deeper than either of us had anticipated. When he pulled back, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay," I said, the word slipping out before I could stop it. His eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice cautious but hopeful. I nodded, my resolve firming. "Yes," I said, my voice steady now. "I'm sure." He smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes, and nodded. "Okay," he said simply. We moved to the couch, sitting side by side, the space between us shrinking with each passing moment. The conversation flowed easily, our words weaving a tapestry of shared experiences, fears, and hopes. He told me about his marriage, how it had unraveled slowly, quietly, until there was nothing left but silence. I shared my own stories, my own struggles, the walls I had built to protect myself. As the night deepened, the storm that had been brewing outside finally broke, rain cascading down in sheets, the sound of it a soothing background to our conversation. The flickering candlelight cast soft shadows on the walls, the room bathed in a warm, golden glow. At some point, he reached out, his hand finding mine again, his fingers intertwining with mine. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. I looked up at him, my heart skipping a beat. "What did you expect?" I asked, my voice soft. He smiled, a small, wistful smile. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it wasn't this." "Is that a good thing?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Very," he said, his gaze steady on mine. I felt a lump rise in my throat, and I looked away, my cheeks warming. "I don't know what I'm doing," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled softly, the sound warm and comforting. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we just figure it out together." I looked up at him, his words settling over me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. "Together," I echoed, my voice steady now. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine again, and I let myself sink into the moment, into the warmth of his touch, the safety of his presence. The storm raged on outside, but inside, there was only the quiet hum of connection, of something new and fragile taking root. When he pulled back, his eyes were soft, filled with something that made my heart ache in the best possible way. "I should probably go," he said, his voice reluctant. I nodded, my chest tightening at the thought of him leaving. "Okay," I whispered. He stood, his hand lingering in mine for a moment before he let go. "I'll see you soon," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of hope. "Soon," I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to leave, and I watched as he walked to the door, his presence leaving a void in the room. Just as he reached for the handle, he paused, turning back to look at me. "I meant what I said," he said, his voice firm now. "I'm not going anywhere." I nodded, my throat tightening. "Neither am I," I said, my voice steady now. He smiled, a small, warm smile that reached his eyes, and then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. I stood there for a moment, the weight of his words settling over me, a sense of something new and hopeful taking root in my chest. The storm outside had quieted, the rain now a gentle patter against the windows. I moved to the couch, sinking into the cushions, the warmth of his presence still lingering in the room. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly, trying to steady myself. He was right. This was new. This was uncharted territory. but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping, their songs cutting through the remnants of the storm's silence. The warmth of the sunlight streaming through the windows felt like a promise, like the world itself was nudging me forward. I stretched, the sheets cool against my skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't rushing to start the day. For once, I let myself linger. I padded through the quiet house, my feet silent on the hardwood floor. The faint scent of coffee from yesterday still lingered, mingling with the clean, crisp air that filtered in from the cracked window in the kitchen. I thought of Daniel, his dark hair still damp from the storm, the way his laugh had filled the room, how his eyes had softened when he spoke of wanting to see where this could go. It was all so unexpected. And yet, it felt right. I wasn't sure what to do with that feeling. I'd spent so long building walls, carefully curating my life to avoid any surprises. But Daniel? He was a surprise I hadn't seen coming, and somehow, I didn't want to run from it. The knock on the door startled me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt, and I found myself smiling before I even reached the door. Daniel. I opened it, and there he was, looking a little unsure, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. His hair was windblown, and his cheeks were flushed from the morning chill. "Hi," he said, his voice low, almost tentative. "Hi," I replied, my smile widening. "Come in." He stepped inside, and I closed the door behind him, the warmth of the house wrapping around us like a cocoon. He turned to me, his expression soft, and for a moment, we just stood there, the air between us thick with something unspoken. I brought this," he said, pulling a small potted plant from behind his back. It was a peace lily, its dark green leaves glossy and vibrant. I thought it might. I don't know. Brighten the place up a bit. I took it from him, my fingers brushing against his, and I felt that familiar spark, that electric current that seemed to flow between us whenever we were close. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." He nodded, his eyes searching mine, and then he reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment,